Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cindy Clare. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Bell Partners. Bell Partners is a fully integrated investment management company based in Greensboro, North Carolina. We have a national platform. We are in 16 different states, and we manage both for our own account as well as for third party. And with me is Alex Jacque, and I'm going to turn it over to Alex to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Cindy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this video cast. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Alex Jacque. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Hayes Gibson Property Services. We are a regional company that's based in Indiana with primarily an affordable housing portfolio spread out over a 16-state area that encompasses everything from the state of Washington and Oregon on through the Midwest and into Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and even West Virginia. So our focus, as I said, is primarily the affordable housing realm, although we do have some conventional housing as well. Cindy and I feel very strongly about this topic. Clearly, we're all experiencing financial stress, both personally and professionally in our lives. And I wanted to kind of start the conversation by sharing some data that Cindy and I pulled together from a variety of resources, including Price Waterhouse, a company called Mercer, and Career Builder. So when we talk about financial stress, I think it's interesting that 85% of Americans report feeling financial anxiety, and that increases at certain generational levels. So boomers are less anxious, probably because they have more resources at 36%. Gen Xers, over half of Gen Xers expressed feeling financial anxiety, and so did almost half of millennials. And when we look at people's income levels, who's living paycheck to paycheck? Over half of workers that make $50,000 or less annually feel like they're living paycheck to paycheck, and that probably encompasses a significant number of our on-site teams. 23% of workers that make between 50 and 100,000 are living paycheck to paycheck, and only 9% of employees in the 100,000 bracket and higher experience living to paycheck to paycheck. Yeah, and the workforce implications for financial stress are significant because the data shows that employees spend an average of 13 hours a month worrying about their personal finances while they're at work, and that financially stressed employees are 5 times more likely to be distracted by finances while they're at work. So lots of data, and employees are even expressing to employers, almost half said that they would want help with debt management. So clearly it's an issue for us, and all of us are addressing it in some way. Cindy, I think, our companies are uniquely different, so I think it would be kind of interesting to talk about, how you feel those differences impact the whole kind of subject of financial stress.
Yeah, Alex, I think it does make a difference. As a company, Bella has about 62,000 apartments across the country, and we're largely conventional and in major markets. And so our employees probably tend to make a little more because they are in major markets, but they also have more expenses because it's more expensive to live in those major markets. So when you think of, I have properties in LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, DC, Denver, Dallas, Austin, Raleigh, Charlotte, all of those are bigger markets. Now, obviously the Sun Belt is a little less expensive, but when you start thinking about the coastal cities, it's much more expensive to live in. You are in more secondary markets with a smaller group, and on the affordable side, which tends to have less high salaries than, say, the conventional side. And so those differences impact how our employees are feeling. I think that it also has a difference when you talk about the population of our employees, whether that's younger people, whether it's single family or single parents, immigrants, and we have all of that within our groups. Are they helping elderly parents? Where does that fall into it? So all of those things come into play. And then the size of your company, allows us, for example, as a larger company to have more resources. So we have employee assistance programs, employee loan programs through their 401k. The EAP also offers financial counseling. So there are different programs that we can offer that some of the smaller regional companies may not be able to, like yours. Although I do think with COVID, and you and I were talking about this, some of the health insurance companies and so forth are even offering those to the regional companies.
Yeah, I think that that's a unique difference, and I'm sure that our listeners are probably saying, every company, one size doesn't fit all. All companies are different. While you're in Denver, I'm in Russellville, Kentucky. That doesn't even qualify as a secondary market. And, and our employees there face different challenges because while there may be more options, for example, for childcare in a primary market, if you don't have a family member living in Russellville, Kentucky, and you have to show up for work and your child is home from school, that creates some financial pressures that are very unique and different. And while the expenses may be lower in rural Kentucky or in rural Mississippi, there are still needs and challenges from a kind of family obligation standpoint that need to be met. And that's kind of a big deal.
Well, there's also a lot less resources. I mean, when you think about the bigger cities, there's far more resources available to our employees, whether that is childcare, whether that is social services. There's far more of that in Denver, as you said, than there is in Russellville, Kentucky. In addition, one of the advantages I think that Bell has done on many of our properties is in those bigger markets, we offer larger discounts to our employees to live on the property, and that helps. And you are restricted on an affordable.
Exactly.
You can do, I think it's one or two, depending on the size of the property, versus I can make those decisions on a conventional level based on ownership and what ownership is willing to do. So that gives us a little more flexibility to allow our associates to live closer and still be affordable.
Yeah, what's been interesting and somewhat heartwarming is how responsive our owners and our owner groups have been to saying, what can I do to help?
Yes.
What can I do to help our employees? Do we offer special they called it hazard pay for people that are coming into work and working those hours when everybody else is kind of hunkered down at home. So, I've been really thrilled to see how concerned owners have been, at least from our perspective. I don't know whether your institutional clients are equally sensitive to some of those things.
They actually are. I think it's been really nice to see, you're exactly right, that people are concerned. And it kind of correlates into what you talked about in the statistics. If our teams are under financial stress or are worrying, that impacts performance. So selfishly, even though you're doing it for the right reasons, which is you want to help your associates, it does help your properties, because an associate that is less financially stressed is going to be much more likely to perform better at the property. So they go hand in hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great segue into kind of the next topic that I'd like to talk about is how financial stress morphs into mental stress. One of the things that I remember talking to our owners about early on in the process, and they were a little bit taken aback. They said, what are you most concerned about with respect to kind of your employees? And I said, frankly, I'm very concerned about their mental health. And some of them were a little taken aback. And I said, well, think about it. They're in an environment where they're concerned about their well-being. They're in an environment where they're concerned about the well-being of their residents, their families, their children. They have the pressures of familial obligations, financial pressures, because one of a spouse may be unemployed as a result of the pandemic, and that morphs into mental stress, anxiety about how much debt they're carrying, unanticipated expenses. You've got a family who had children in school, and all of a sudden they're paying for childcare. assuming they can find it. And that's an expense and a burden they hadn't expected. God forbid someone is infected and there are medical expenses that could be unanticipated. We talked about household unemployment, and at least within the affordable housing community, we find a lot of employees have multi-generational households. And if you have children at home and you're caring for your parents or grandparents or your spouse's grandparents, that pressure and that stress, both financially and mentally, takes its toll and manifests itself in how people perform in the workplace.
To add to that, these same employees are listening to the stories, particularly on the affordable side. We have it on the conventional side as well, but I'm sure your teams are hearing far more impact from COVID. And so they're listening to people coming in every day and telling them what's happening to, that I've lost my job or I've had a family member get sick. So not only do they have their own issues, they are listening to all of these stories from our residents and trying to be caring and help them, but understanding that they still have a property to run. So it's an added burden. I mean, they are the front lines, truly.
Well, and Cindy, you and I probably both experienced this. I certainly do. I didn't realize how truly multicultural our communities are until I started getting requests from our employees to translate documents into Burmese and Croatian and Russian, because they were concerned that the COVID stuff that we were communicating within our communities wasn't being understood by people in those communities. So again, while it's not necessarily financial stress, it's a component of it that morphs into the mental stress that we were talking about.
Then let's add to that how many of our employees going into the gender differences. About, I would say, 60 to 70%, if not higher, of our site employees, particularly on the manager side, are women. And many of those women are single parents. And so add the financial burden of being a single parent, and then all of the things you just talked about, which is school-age children being at home, trying to manage those, finding reliable sources of childcare. If they don't have family around, how do they manage that? What is that extra burden of the cost of childcare and responsibility? Not to sound sexist, but most of the responsibility for elderly parents tends to fall to the females.
You and I have both experienced that personally.
Yes, we have. And so when that happens, that's another added burden. And what if your parents are now having financial difficulties as well? And so I think you add all of those burdens in, and as you said, some of them are not financial, but many of them are. They just add to that mental health and the anxiousness that people have and the stress that people have.
It's interesting because when I stopped and thought about where those financial stresses came from, one of the things that didn't occur to me is access to internet connectivity in some of these rural areas where some of our employees live when children are not in school and they're trying to learn online. And what does that look like? And how do you accommodate for that? And we ended up setting up essentially study areas in some of our clubhouses where we have the ability to do that, where we had internet connectivity so that children could come in and social distance with masks and use the bandwidth that we had available because they had no other way to learn. And it's just not something that I had thought about. We take internet for granted now. It's like turning on your faucet and water runs out of it. But that's not always the case.
I think that's a very good point. That's one advantage of being in more of the major markets is that internet connectivity is important. But if you think about the financial stress, what if they can't afford for the internet connectivity anymore? I think that's the other piece of it that comes into play. Or even if you've got great internet, if you have four of you trying to use that bandwidth all at the same time, we all know what that looks like, and it doesn't work particularly well. So I agree. I think, all of these things that we've taken for granted, we've had to rethink as we've gone through this crisis.
I think that we talk about financial stress amongst employees and kind of the mental stress that kind of parallels that financial stress in many instances. One of the other things I've observed, and I'd be curious about kind of your experience, is that our employees also take on the burden of resident financial stress.
Yes.
When residents come into the office and sit down with tears in their eyes and say, my husband just lost his job. I don't know how we're going to make the car payment. And not only do they have their own financial burdens, but they're also taking on and listening to kind of the ongoing stresses that residents are facing. We're pressuring them to collect the rent and make sure that we can get our bills paid and the mortgage gets paid. And they're worrying about squeezing that rent check out of someone whose personal story they just listened to and empathize with, and how that plays out in their lives as well.
I think that's exactly right. And what we've seen in our communities, and it's been actually wonderful to see, is that the community managers and the staff at the properties have organized food drives. They've organized libraries, anything to help their residents. We even had a resident at another community come in and say, you know what, I have, here's $700. Can you apply this to someone whose rent needs to be paid? And the manager was so taken aback, but it brought her to tears. And what she ended up doing is putting the names in the hat of people that hadn't paid their rent. And being able to call a resident and say, someone anonymously has paid your rent for you, was very heartwarming. But they do take it very personally, and they do care about their residents. So, we've been very active with a group called Move for Hunger to help get food to local community food banks, because we know that that's an issue in these communities, and our employees see that firsthand. And so that certainly has an impact on them as well.
Well, it's interesting because when the first round of stimulus checks went out last summer, we had several people, I've lost track, come by our properties and say, I don't need this stimulus check. I'd like for you to apply it to someone's rent. And how do I go about making that happen? So, I think those human interest stories are out there. One of our major clients is the Salvation Army, and we do a lot of management for them, both in Indiana as well as in Minnesota and in Illinois. And they collectively put together care packets for residents, not only at their properties, but other properties that we manage on behalf of nonprofits. And, we laughed about it, but, it had toilet paper when toilet paper was a commodity, and paper towel and sanitizer and masks and wipes and all kinds of things. So I think the response from the community has been terrific, but, our employees have sort of been that lightning rod where they're kind of hearing it all, feeling their own stresses and concerns, and then taking on the burden of listening and trying to respond to everybody else's as well.
And I think one of the things that we can do, one of the things that we did early on was to give our associates some of the resources that are out there that they could share with residents, so that because they want to help these residents, and there are resources. And so I think that the people that come to us with, I can't pay my rent, are the ones that we can help. The ones that are hard are the ones that we never hear from. The ones that have, that are not answering their phones, their emails, their texts, whatever we've done to try to reach them. But I agree with you. I think that is an additional stress on our teams, that they're absorbing a lot of these stories and they see it and hear it. Not to mention dealing with people who have either gotten seriously ill or lost a family member or lost a resident on the property from COVID.
Well, we had to put protocols in place, basically saying that we didn't want employees doing wellness checks where there was a concern about the well-being of a resident, because in very early on in the pandemic, we lost 4 residents on a property. They were elderly, but it was difficult. So even the protocols were critical. But I think that empathy that our employees feel towards residents is so real, and I've never felt it more than I have certainly felt it over the last 8 to 10 months. I looked at my calendar the other day, and we're heading towards 12 months of quarantining of one sort or another.
Yes.
And I think that has had a huge impact. I'm taking a mental health first aid course next month, just to better understand how to adults in those situations. And Cindy, I'd be curious how you think your employees are doing in response to kind of potential corporate layoffs or furloughs. Have you experienced any of that, or are you sensing it?
We've been very fortunate on the operations side of our business, or overall on Bell as a whole, that we've had very few layoffs. Where we have had some layoffs or furloughs have been on the construction side. And we were, again, very fortunate because most of ours is rehab work, that it was not very many people, but it certainly has an impact, and people do feel that. And reassuring your associates that their jobs are stable and that we're not looking to cut jobs. But early on in the pandemic, when you were doing staggered shifts, and how did you pay people if they weren't working a full 40-hour week? I think there was a lot of stress, far more around that than necessarily layoffs or furloughs. It was really, how do we manage to pay people? And to your point, a lot of our owners stepped up and said, pay them anyway. We want to keep them safe, but we need, we can't have them all in the office at the same time because of that, but we don't want somebody to lose their paycheck. So I think some of the things like that we've been able to do have helped ease some of that burden. Moving forward, one of the advantages of being in the multifamily industry is you still have to run the properties. And so those site teams probably are the safest associates we have. It's on the corporate side where I think people are a little more nervous. And again, Bell's been very fortunate that we have not had to lay anybody off on a corporate level, simply because our business has been very stable and we've been able to keep everybody employed. But I do believe that it's more about the, staggered shifts and maybe not working a full 40-hour week. And going back to your numbers, when somebody's making $50,000 or less than $100,000 a year, and you take even 10% of their salary away, that's a big burden on someone.
Well, it absolutely is. And, we've been fortunate as well not to have furloughed anybody, but I think that employees can't help but feel anxious and stressed out if they hear that friends are being furloughed. They may not be at our companies, but if a management company down the street has just laid off 3 accountants, or reduced hours for the on-site team because rent collections are down, that has an impact. It has a direct impact on them, obviously mentally, and they're concerned about their financial well-being. I'm curious, Cindy, early on with the CARES Act, we had requirements for paid PTO. And some of our employees burned through those 80 hours of PTO because of their own health issues or the issues of their loved ones. How are you handling PTO that people have burned through and no longer have available to them and are facing additional illness?
So last year we gave everybody additional paid time off to cover for illness. And then one of the things that we did going into 2021 is we allowed people to carry over extra so that they can use that vacation or sick, whatever PTO they had, for those situations. Knock on wood, we've been very fortunate because we have short-term disability and those things in place. We've not had someone run out of leave, and we have not had to face that. I think we would look at it on a case-by-case basis, but in general, what we've tried to do is make sure that we allowed people to carry over their PTO so that they could use it if they needed it. And so that's been one of the big things we've done. But you're right. The question becomes what happens as we go further into this. It has been a year, and it doesn't look like we'll be out of this before at least the summer, which means that you may see more of this, and then we're going to have to address it again. And that can, again, as you said earlier, those medical issues and long-term medical issues can certainly have add another financial burden to our employees.
Yeah, we've been talking about paychecks, but when we stop and look at benefits and how those financial implications are, we did something similar, but we've also allowed people to take PTO before they're eligible for PTO, for example. Yes. Well, the CARES Act required it, but even beyond that, and also augmented our PTO. One of the other things that we're looking at, and I'm strongly pushing our HR people about, is to create a PTO bank from which employees could donate their time, or employees could draw time that who have exhausted their own PTO, as a way of giving them that safety net in the event that they need extra hours. And it's a tough thing to manage, but it's also something that I think truly expresses the care and concern that an employer has for their employees if they burn through PTO through no fault of their own. So
we allowed people to have negative balances as well for exactly the same reason. And so I think there are different, to your point, Alex, you can be creative, particularly in privately held companies. It's a little harder in publicly held companies. And it is harder when you're larger, because what you do, again, we operate in California, and there's a whole different set of rules in California than there is anywhere else in the country. And so managing through all of that and trying to care about your employees, but to follow the laws and to make sure you are being as fair as possible presents challenges. But I do think it's going to take creativity on the employer's part to help employees get through this.
Well, I think one size doesn't fit all in the current environment that we're in, and we need to take a look at every single employee's unique situation, and within the context of the law and being fair, be as human and sensitive to the needs of that employee as we can, because selfishly, I think it bears its own rewards, because employees that feel like they've been treated fairly and that their employer has gone above and beyond to take care of them are less likely to be looking for the next opportunity somewhere else.
Right. You want your employees to feel valued, and you want them to know that you care about them. And I think that goes a long way. You're exactly right in keeping good employees with you. They're much less likely to go look for that next opportunity if they feel like they're going to be cared for at the company they're currently at. So yeah, I absolutely agree.
We're in the process of reviewing our health insurance coverage. Our health insurance coverage policy renews on the 1st of July. And we're drilling down very carefully on how we ensure that employees don't take a big financial hit or a reduction in benefits during a critical period in the employee's lives. So we're looking at whether we need to absorb some of that burden kind of moving forward, or at least not pass on any additional cost to employees during a time when things are pretty tight financially for everyone. Are you doing anything?
Yeah, we are again, an advantage of being a larger company is we're self-insured, and we were able to keep our premiums exactly the same for our associates. They did not see any increase in their costs, and the benefits have stayed the same. So we didn't reduce any of the benefits, and we were able to keep the costs the same. And fortunately, we were actually able to give them a little bit of savings back in 2020. So, we looked very hard at that, and we watched it very carefully to make sure, like you said, that we could provide the benefits that our employees need, but keep their costs down, knowing that this was going to, this was critical for them right now. So we did the exact same thing.
So, we're kind of talking about corporate decisions and the things that we're looking at and doing differently. It kind of segues into, what are you doing from a site standpoint to adjust, to lower occupancies, to lower rent collections? Are you doing anything differently? Have you had any huge revelations about changing the way you operate?
Well, we had to change the way we operated completely. As I know you and I've discussed, we both had to, particularly early on when we were in complete lockdown. How do you service your residents? How do you take care of them when you really shouldn't be in their apartments? You really don't want them coming into the leasing office. How do you lease apartments? How do you manage the community? So the protocol, and protect your employees, keep them from getting sick. So the protocols that we've put in place, from shields on all the desks, requiring every associate to wear a mask, in some, using temperature checks, using apps. Now we have a health app that everybody uses, putting in protocols, getting electrostatic sprayers at all of the properties, going to artificial intelligence on the websites, virtual tours, self-guided tours, collecting rent electronically. All of those things, I think we've been very fortunate to keep our occupancies higher as a result of that, because we moved fairly quickly to put all of that in place. On the collection side, again, an advantage of being on the conventional side and having higher incomes is that the vast majority of our residents continue to pay their rent. The challenge becomes that 3 to 4% that aren't, and the compounding of those rents. So when you get, and you and I both know, once someone's 60 to 90 days late, we are never seeing that rent ever again. But we can't evict them. And we know in many cases that they just can't pay. So we offered payment plans. We waived late fees early on in the pandemic. We've tried as much as we can to help our residents stay in their homes, and yet do our fiduciary responsibility to our clients and our investors. By the way, many of our investors are retirement funds and pension funds. And so if we don't make those returns, then those retirees don't get their income either. So it's a balancing act of working with your residents to try to get some payments out of them, but also, doing your fiduciary responsibility to your clients. So I think that if you looked at everything that we do, we've changed the protocols on how we do it from an operational standpoint on the sites.
Isn't it interesting that there are still owners and clients out there that don't understand there are eviction moratoriums in place?
Yes.
Or that we were precluded from charging late fees on, at least on federally assisted properties. I'm constantly surprised that some people still operate in this bubble of, I think we should do resident events, and I think we should, I don't understand why your rent collections are down. So,
right.
And on the affordable housing side, it's no secret that particular segment of the industry has been slow to embrace technology because there's never really truly been a need to. And when we put our COVID protocols in place, March last year, one of the things that we did is I instituted conference calls twice a week so that people could ask questions and call in and get straight answers. And it was amazing to me that, the simple things that I had taken for granted on the multifamily side that we were doing on the affordable side, residents want to pay their rent by credit card, and we don't have the capacity to do that. Right. And it was sort of one of those what moments. And we found ourselves kind of diving headlong into technology solutions that probably our nonprofits and other owners never would have considered or thought about as a necessary expense until we said to them, look, these are not only good business decisions, but they're the right protocols for the kind of environment that we find ourselves in. And, interestingly enough, obviously, we're never going to go back.
Correct.
So just out of curiosity, what are the things that you've implemented that you've said, well, we're not going back to what was normal. This is going to be kind of our new way of doing business. Anything in particular?
I think there's several things. I mean, I think that the idea of, unfortunately in the conventional world, we were moving towards some of these things already. The truth is we moved a lot faster. So if there's one silver lining in this pandemic, it's that we adopted technology that we would have probably tested for a year before we put it in place. And we adopted it in 3 weeks across the portfolio. So the things like the virtual tours, the self-guided tours, giving residents prospects the option, electronic rent payments, whether that's pay by text, pay through ACH, credit cards. We were already doing credit cards, but now we're looking at other ways to get. We saw a 20% lift in getting people to pay electronically. So now over 85% of our residents pay electronically. And I don't think that will go back. I think that will stay the same. I don't think virtual tours will go away, nor do I think self-guided tours will go away. Some people will prefer that. People will still prefer in-person as well, but I think it's giving people different levers to pull and meeting residents' needs in multiple ways versus one way. I do think it's interesting, and you mentioned that you have some owners that just don't understand that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And it's been fascinating to watch having some owners, as you said, push and say, evict these people. And other owners pull back and say, don't file at all. Hold off.
Or don't give rent increases.
Don't give rent increases, or don't assess late fees. And that's both institutional as well as smaller owners. So it's been very interesting to watch the reactions. And it's funny because they tend to be on one extreme or the other. But I do think that a lot of mobile maintenance, more protocols for your maintenance guys, using technology with our maintenance teams, things we were starting to test that we're now just rolling out. And I think all of those things will stay in place. Virtual training, virtual onboarding, all of that, it doesn't take the place of in-person, but it certainly allows you to do things more quickly until you can get to the in-person. And right now, obviously, the only way, as we are doing right now, is virtual.
So, we talk about financial stress, and we talk about the financial stress of our employees and how that impacts kind of financial stress with residents. And what about vendors? I'm starting to see some pressure on the vendor side where vendors are concerned about payment, and vendors are concerned about timeliness of payment and being able to keep their staffs employed. We've gone to electronic billing and invoicing, and have found that we can pay more promptly. How about you?
Yeah, we had been doing electronic billing, and what we've seen is more and more of our smaller vendors who were not adopting it before have adopted it. And that does help people get paid more quickly. I think that as we've all seen when the market softens, we are pushing our vendors as well to keep their pricing down. Because we're not getting the same revenues. And so we need to be, and our owners are looking hard at expenses. So I do expect that the vendors are feeling some of that pain. In addition, they can't get out to the properties. I do wonder how many of those vendors will start pulling back on the in-person, since they've been able to do a lot of this successfully on a virtual basis. I mean, we're still not allowing just vendor visits. We obviously have the suppliers coming out and dropping things off at the properties and services being done at the communities, but the in-person just drop by is not allowed at any of our properties currently.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting for vendors to realize that we don't make decisions about services and providers based on the coffee and the cupcakes that show up on
Correct.
Friday morning, and that their resources are better spent in other ways. But what we have found is that vendors have been very willing to be supportive, provide training, provide a variety of resources, source PPE for us when we've not been able to. And we've really appreciated those partnerships. You can tell which vendors are truly concerned and also kind of feel the stresses and financial strains and take those on their shoulders, just the way our employees do with residents.
Agreed. And I think that there are vendors out there that have been very flexible and have been very innovative, and that have helped us create solutions when we're looking at something and going, wow, we can't do this, this way anymore. What can we do? So I agree. I think those partnerships with those vendors is critical to us and has been very helpful.
So from a financial perspective, you were going to think back over the last 10 months. What is the biggest aha moment for you that has kind of said, well, I didn't think about that, or isn't this interesting, or why didn't we do this sooner?
Wow. There are so many of those. I would say that you hit the nail on the head when you talked about technology and some of the things that we implemented very quickly and said, oh, well, we were going to, we would have taken a much longer time. And now we're thinking, wow, we can really implement something quickly and deal with the bumps versus a slow rollout, because you still have the bumps. And so I think that was one of the big aha moments. From a financial standpoint, I think the ability to continue to run your properties and continue to perform in the midst of a pandemic when you're trying to shut down has been one of the big aha moments. What our site teams have been able to accomplish, and quite frankly, our regional managers and our VPs, what they've been able to accomplish in the middle of a crisis is awe-inspiring.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we begin to drill down to what's essential and what's not essential.
Yeah.
And we used to think everything was essential. So yeah, the technology piece, and I think that it's been rewarding to see how creative people have been.
Yes.
If I think about it from a financial standpoint, and I look at our corporate budget and realize how much money we spent on travel, on hotels, on airlines, and I look at the property performance this year over last year, or 2020 over 2019, where we spent 10% of the travel budget that we budgeted, but our property performance was equal to, or in some instances better, in most markets. And I think to myself, wow, here's dollars that are being spent. And when we think about financial stress of our employees, there are financial stresses to being away from home overnight.
Yep.
Regardless of how well paid people are, there are things that hit your pocketbook when you travel, and you and I travel a lot, and so we know what those are. And our employees that are in that 50K to 100K range are absorbing those costs in many instances because they've got childcare and they've got elder care and they've got other things going on. So that's been a revelation for me, and I'm really rethinking kind of our expectations in that regard. And clearly it's a lot cheaper to get everybody on a Zoom call than bring them in for an annual meeting. Now, you miss the camaraderie, you miss a lot of that, but I think we're going to find ourselves in a world where those kinds of meetings are more blended, that we combine the virtual with the in-person and try to find a good balance in between. So
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, we're in the midst of our conference and we can invite a whole lot more people virtually. And so I don't think we'll ever go back. We will go back to an in-person, but I don't think we'll ever go back to an only in-person. I agree with you. I think it'll be a blend.
and we're doing a lot more training.
And we're doing a lot more training.
We're doing a little mini sessions. Everybody's embraced the technology. We're all Zoom exhausted or Teams exhausted or whatever platform you're on. But the reality is it's been incredibly helpful and cost effective. So,
Yes.
That being said, I think that we continue to have to monitor the stresses on our employees, whether they're financial or mental or otherwise, and figure out how to best address those in a way that's unique to the employee bases that we have.
I absolutely agree. I think that as we go through this, we have to be flexible and adjust based on what we're seeing happening on the ground at the time, whether that's financial, whether that's mental, whatever those forces are, we need to be listening and aware and make sure we make adjustments, as we can. We can't always, but where we can, we should, and we should be listening for that.
Great words to end on. I've really enjoyed having this conversation. It's been fun. It's been enlightening, and I hope our listeners have benefited some from you and I chatting, as we often do, about common themes in our businesses, even though we manage very different companies. So it's been great being with you, Cindy.
Great being with you as always, Alex. I think very insightful, and I've always enjoyed it. The time flew, and I hope our listeners take away some nuggets from this. So thank you.